Evan Cole raised his voice in the middle of the dining hall, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, old man, what were you back then? Some low-rank nobody. Or just peeling potatoes in a kitchen?" A few laughs broke out, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. Cole didn't stop. He liked the feeling of being watched. "Look at him," Cole continued, his voice dripping with contempt. 70-something years old and still sitting here. You really think anyone still cares about your past? Henry Caldwell didn't look up. He held his fork and cut into the meat on his tray slowly, precisely, as if the words spoken a moment ago had never existed. Cole let out a dry laugh and turned to the young officers standing nearby. "See that silence is always how people with nothing to show try to hide." He took half a step closer, his tone colder now. "I'm talking to you. Or did you forget who you used to be?" Caldwell still didn't answer. Not a word. Not a glance. He continued eating his lunch so calm that the air around him began to feel heavy. The clinking of utensils against trays grew sparse. A few people stopped eating altogether, their eyes fixed on the table in the corner. Cole crossed his arms and sneered. "Just like I thought." Nothing to say. He stood there, savoring the silence he believed he had created, unaware that some people are silent, not because they are empty, but because they have lived through things that need no explanation. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories so together we may preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence of our quiet heroes. Henry Caldwell didn't look up. He remained seated there, back straight, shoulders squared, as if lifelong discipline still held him in place, even though all that lay before him was a tray of food slowly growing cold. His hand tightened gently around the memorial ceremony program resting on the table. The paper cover had softened its edges, worn from being opened again and again, as if it were not an inanimate booklet at all, but the only thing still binding him to the names inside. Names without voices, without faces, left only as memory. Caldwell didn't react. He didn't breathe harder. He showed no sign of unease. His silence was not avoidance, but a choice one forged over years of learning how to survive by keeping emotion from ever reaching the surface, even when death stood very close. Beneath his old jacket, a steel dog tag quietly came into view. Not polished, not new. Its edges had been worn smooth, its surface scarred by time and sweat from years no one else in that room had lived through. It lay still against his chest, like a part of his body, like a quiet reminder that some identities do not need to be announced. The space around him began to sink into itself. The laughter from moments before faded faster than anyone expected. Casual remarks lost their momentum. A few spoons lightly tapped against trays, then stopped altogether. Young soldiers at nearby tables slowed their movements, as if they had just sensed something was wrong, but couldn't yet name it. Their eyes drifted toward the corner table where the old man still sat with his head bowed, saying nothing. A young soldier paused mid-chew, his throat shifting slightly. "He's not reacting," someone murmured, almost a whisper. No one replied. No reply was needed. That silence began to spread, not loudly, not by force. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the kind that compels observation, that forces people to question. Caldwell remained there, his gaze fixed on a single line in the program, as if the world beyond it no longer existed. He read slowly, very slowly, each name appearing, then fading again, with every turn of the page. Each name had once been a face that smiled, a voice that carried, a man who had once eaten beside him in places where a meal could be cut short at any moment. Caldwell held the booklet tightly, not because he feared dropping it, but because it was the only way to keep those memories from slipping away. No one in the room knew what he was thinking, but something in his posture and that calm restraint made people hesitate to keep laughing. Caldwell's silence wasn't empty. It had weight. It pressed lightly against the room just enough to make continuing the mockery feel uncomfortable, like playing a game that had gone too far. Another young soldier set his spoon down and straightened his back. "Maybe we should stop," he said quietly, so low it sounded like he was speaking only to himself. No one issued an order. No one demanded anything. But the focus had shifted. The eyes now resting on Caldwell were no longer cheap curiosity, but caution. There was something about that man that made people pull back, even though he hadn't said a word. Caldwell turned the page. His hand paused for a very brief moment, as if one name had pulled him back to a place far away. Then he continued reading. Steady, patient, needing no one to understand, needing no one to acknowledge him. That silence was no longer a void. It became a question hanging in the minds of those watching. A question about the past, about what had shaped the man before them, about why some people don't need to speak in order to be heard. And in that very moment, when the room began to feel the true weight of silence, the mockery that followed would no longer be mere words, but a public act of humiliation. Evan Cole didn't stop. He lowered his voice by half, but each word cut sharper, clear enough for those nearby to hear. "You're a civilian, aren't you?" Cole tilted his head, staring straight at Caldwell, as if he'd just found a weakness. "Civilians should know their place. This isn't where you belong." A young officer standing behind him let out a soft laugh. Maybe he thinks wearing an old tag lets him sit with officers. The laughter wasn't loud, but it spread quickly. A few others joined in just enough to turn it into agreement. Cole crossed his arms, his tone carrying the confidence of someone who believed he was enforcing order. "I see this kind of fake military act all the time," he said. "Buy a few old items, wear them, and suddenly think everyone owes you respect." Another voice chimed in, half joking, half serious. Maybe he never even stepped outside an air-conditioned office. Caldwell didn't look up. He simply turned the next page of the memorial program. The thin paper made a faint sound. He read the next name, his lips moving just enough to form the words. One name, then another. Names that were no longer here to defend themselves. Cole smirked when Caldwell remained silent. "See," he said to the group of young officers. "Can't even argue back." Another laugh followed this one louder. "Probably because there's nothing to argue." Caldwell straightened the booklet carefully. His hand paused briefly along the edge of the page, as if one name had brushed against a deeper memory. He didn't lift his head, but his shoulders drew just slightly straighter. Not defiance, just resolve. Cole stepped closer by half a pace. "I'm talking to you," he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "If you really served, say it. Or are you afraid of being questioned?" Another young officer burst out laughing. "Yeah, go on. Where were you stationed? Which unit, or is it all just a story to get attention?" These words were no longer jokes. They stacked one atop another, turning Caldwell's silence into a pretext, a justification for the crowd to pass judgment. At a nearby table, a young soldier glanced over, then down at his tray. He didn't laugh. "This has gone too far," he muttered, but his voice was swallowed by the others' laughter. Cole didn't hear him, or chose not to. "You know what really gets under my skin," Cole continued. "People like you. Not sure you've ever done anything yet. You insist on sitting where you don't belong." Caldwell turned the page. "Rodriguez Miguel," he read softly. 1968. The name cut through the laughter out of place, yet unmistakably clear. A few people faltered. Not for long. Just a brief moment. Cole frowned. "What are you doing? Reading names?" Caldwell replied, his voice low and even without challenge. "Just an honest answer." Cole laughed again, this time openly contemptuous. "Reading names for what? To make us emotional." He shook his head. "This isn't a memorial." From farther away, a senior female service member lifted her head. She didn't join the exchange, but her gaze lingered on the corner table. She saw the booklet. She saw the old dog tag beneath the jacket. And she saw that Caldwell's silence didn't look like uncertainty. Cole kept going, unaware he had crossed a line. "If you're just a civilian," he said, his voice turning cold, "then stop pretending you belong here." Caldwell didn't answer. He simply turned the next page. By now, the laughter was uneven. Some had fallen silent. Others still laughed, but more slowly, as if they weren't sure anymore why they were laughing at all. The humiliation was no longer a single remark. It had become a public spectacle. One man placed at the center of the room labeled stripped of his past while choosing to remain silent. And when the mockery crossed the line from careless teasing into collective insult, some eyes began to watch, not to laugh, but to realize what Evan Cole had yet to understand. Maria Lopez lifted her head as the laughter around the room began to thin out. She didn't rush. It was simply a familiar reflex, one learned by someone who had spent enough years in uniform to recognize when something wasn't right. Her eyes didn't go to Evan Cole first. They settled on the corner table where Henry Caldwell still sat unmoving. Lopez noticed his haircut before anything else. High and tight. Clean. Not a single stray strand. It wasn't the style of someone chasing fashion, but the style of discipline kept even when no one was left to demand it. She had seen that haircut before on older soldiers' men who carried military habits the way others carried parts of their own bodies. Her gaze dropped to his posture. Caldwell sat upright, not leaning back, not slack, both feet planted firmly on the floor. His shoulders hadn't sagged, even though age showed clearly in the lines of his skin. It wasn't the posture of a man trying to prove something. It was a posture burned into the spine, shaped by years of having to be ready to stand at a moment's notice. Then Lopez saw the dog tag. Not the shiny kind, not new, not something easily bought. It was old steel, dark gray edges worn smooth. The chain had softened with sweat and time. It rested quietly beneath the jacket, as if it needed no attention yet. To Lopez, it shone brighter than anything else in the room. She didn't speak. She simply stood there and watched. The space around them continued to settle. The sound of utensils striking trays nearly disappeared. A few young soldiers stopped laughing, stopped looking at Evan Cole, and turned their attention to the old man sitting in silence. There was something in that silence that made it impossible to keep treating this as entertainment. Cole kept talking. His voice still carried, but it no longer sounded as sure of itself. "He's putting on an act," Cole said, trying to keep the mockery alive. "Staying quiet to look mysterious? Old trick." Lopez didn't look at Cole. She watched the way Caldwell turned each page of the booklet. Slow, steady, as if every name were an obligation that had to be fulfilled. His hand didn't tremble. He didn't linger too long. Just enough to read and remember. A young soldier at a nearby table swallowed hard. "He doesn't look like a fake," the soldier said softly, almost as if only speaking to himself. No one answered, but a few heads nodded slightly. It wasn't clear whether they agreed or were simply acknowledging that the thought wasn't unreasonable. Lopez shifted her position by a single step, enough to see more clearly. She noticed how Caldwell didn't react to the insults at all. No frown, no clenched jaw, no flash of anger, the kind people usually showed when cornered. That calm wasn't resignation. It was the calm of someone who had endured far worse, to the point that small cruelty no longer deserved a response. She remembered faces like that. Men who returned from war with eyes older than their years. Men who spoke very little, but when they did, entire rooms fell silent. Men who didn't need to recount their achievements, because the way they stood, the way they sat, already told the story. Cole continued, but his words began to miss their mark. If he really served, Cole said, he wouldn't be this quiet. Lopez tilted her head slightly. She knew that was wrong. The people who had been closest to death were usually the ones who spoke least about it. Silence wasn't because they had nothing to say, but because they had said too much to themselves already. A few young soldiers began to look at Cole differently. No more encouragement, no more laughter, just watchfulness, cautious and uncertain. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could feel that a line had just been crossed. Caldwell still didn't look up. He kept reading. One more name, then another, as if every line were a promise he could not abandon no matter what unfolded around him. Lopez let out a quiet breath. Very quiet. She didn't intervene, not yet. But in her mind, the balance had already shifted. This was no longer a story about a young lieutenant and a silent old man. This was a story about respect, about who truly belonged in that place. And in the moment, Maria Lopez understood that when the silence had grown deep enough to force reflection, the words about to be spoken would no longer come from the one mocking, but from those beginning to realize what they were truly standing in front of. Evan Cole paused for a moment, as if realizing that the silence in front of him had lasted too long. He wasn't used to being unanswered. His voice dropped, but grew sharper. "All right," he said, each word landing clearly. "If you really served, then say it. What was your rank?" A few young officers behind him murmured. "Yeah," someone cut in. "Go on, say it. Or are you afraid to?" Cole folded his arms, his gaze locked on Caldwell. "This isn't a place for mystery games," he continued. "If you think staying silent is enough, you're wrong." Caldwell kept his head bowed. He didn't rush. He didn't respond right away. His hand brushed lightly along the edge of the memorial program, as if searching for the exact place to stop. He turned to the next page and read another name. Then he stopped completely. The entire room waited, not because they believed Caldwell would answer, but because the silence had turned into something uncomfortable. A void that forced people to listen. "Did you hear me?" Cole said, irritation now clear in his voice. "What was your rank?" Caldwell looked up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around for support. He simply stared straight ahead, as if the question hadn't been aimed at him, but at the object in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying no trace of defiance. "This book," Caldwell said, his hand lightly touching the cover, "is the names of those who never came home." No one laughed. The sentence wasn't long, not poetic. It didn't mention his own achievements or past, but it fell into the room like a heavy object, suddenly rendering all the mockery before it unnecessary. A few people turned their faces away. Others instinctively straightened their backs. Cole blinked. "What are you talking about?" "You're dodging my question." Caldwell didn't answer again. He lowered his gaze back to the book, as if what needed to be said had been said. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't fragile. It had shape. It had weight. At another table, David Ross stood up, not hurried, not attention-seeking. Just a decisive movement from someone accustomed to reacting when something important clicked into place. Ross didn't look at Cole. His eyes were fixed on the dog tag peeking out from beneath Caldwell's jacket. He slowed his steps slightly, just enough to see it clearly. Old steel, a worn chain, engraving faded by time. Ross swallowed hard. Something in his memory began to align lessons, fragmented stories, names never listed in official records. "That can't be Ross," whispered so softly, it sounded like he was speaking only to himself. Cole turned toward him. "What are you doing, standing up? Sit down." Ross didn't answer right away. His eyes never left the dog tag. He noticed how Caldwell held the book, the calm that didn't need proof. And for the first time in that room, someone wasn't looking at Caldwell like a man being interrogated, but like a symbol placed in the wrong setting. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Ross asked, his voice lower now. Cole frowned. "I'm talking to someone who won't state his rank." Ross shook his head ever so slightly. "No," he said. "You're talking to something you don't yet understand." Caldwell still didn't look up, but Ross's presence changed the rhythm of the room. A few young soldiers began to follow his gaze. They looked at the dog tag. They looked at the book. They started connecting details they had ignored before. Cole forced a laugh. "Great. Another one making a big deal out of this." Ross didn't smile. He straightened. "There are things that don't need exaggeration," he said. "They speak for themselves." The silence now no longer surrounded Caldwell alone. It spread, touching everyone standing there. Questions began to form, not about the silent old man, but about the way they had all looked at him from the very beginning. And as David Ross remained standing, his eyes never leaving that old dog tag, what had once been dismissed as an ordinary object began to turn into a symbol that would force those with authority to step into this room. The arrival of General Thomas Reed wasn't loud, but it was enough to change the atmosphere of the room instantly. He didn't need to speak right away. Simply standing there, back straight, eyes sweeping once across the space, was enough for the remaining conversations to stop on their own. Reed was accustomed to entering rooms like this, places where a single look could alter the order of things. His gaze settled on the table in the corner, not because Evan Cole was standing there, not because of the tense faces around it, but because of the old steel dog tag peeking out from beneath the jacket of the elderly man sitting quietly. Reed looked more closely. He didn't squint. He didn't lean in. He simply looked. And in that moment, the expression on the two-star general's face paused ever so slightly, as if an old memory had been stirred awake. Old steel, a style of engraving no longer used. Where that could only come from years of constant use, never removed, even when no one remained to demand it. Maria Lopez took half a step forward. She tilted her head and made out the faded engraving. The letters were worn, but not gone. Her throat went dry as she realized those familiar markings weren't something that could be copied for show. They were traces of a time she had only heard about spoken of in lowered voices with absolute reverence. "That can't be," Lopez whispered, barely audible. David Ross didn't wait another second. He snapped to attention, feet drawing together by reflex. His hand came up sharp, deliberate. No hesitation. No command needed. A clean, precise salute directed straight at Henry Caldwell. The sound of the movement wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw eyes. A special operations officer standing at attention, saluting an old man in a worn jacket. The moment itself posed a question no one dared to ask out loud. General Reed took another step forward. "What are you doing?" Evan Cole blurted out, his voice slipping for a beat. "Standing at attention for..." Him, Reed turned his head. Silence, he said, no raised voice, no emphasis required. Cole shut his mouth immediately. Reed looked back at Henry Caldwell. His gaze was no longer searching. It carried the certainty of someone who had just fitted the final pieces together. He straightened slightly and spoke, his voice low and clear, carrying evenly across the room. Colonel Henry Caldwell. The name landed like a marker. No explanation needed. No further words required. Just 3 words enough to reverse everything. Caldwell looked up for the second time since the story began. He met Reed's eyes. No surprise. No excessive emotion. Just a very slight nod, as if returning a greeting to an old peer. The room stood. No one called a command. No one signaled. Yet one by one, nearly in unison, people rose as if their bodies understood what their minds were still catching up to. Chairs shifted. Hands released food trays. Everyone stood straight in silence. Evan Cole froze. His face drained of color. Colonel, he stammered. Sir, I... Reed raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Not now, he said. He turned back to Caldwell. It's an honor to see you again, Colonel Reed said, slower this time. We've read about your operations. Not all of them were recorded. Caldwell lowered his eyes to the memorial program. I'm only here to read their names, he said. Tomorrow is the ceremony. Reed nodded. Yes, sir. The respect in his voice wasn't ceremonial. It came from the understanding that the man before him had carried burdens later generations could only learn about through books if they were ever allowed to learn at all. Ross remained in his salute. Lopez stood straighter, her eyes never leaving Caldwell. The young soldiers around them began to realize they had just witnessed something rare, a moment when authority didn't need to be enforced by orders, but established by truth alone. Caldwell closed the book. Slowly, gently, as if closing a piece of memory. And as the room settled into that shared recognition, as the true identity had finally been spoken aloud, what followed would no longer be the story of an insult, but a lesson for those who had never understood who they were truly standing before. General Thomas Reed turned back to face the room, which stood frozen in silence. He didn't speak loudly yet. Every word was clear, carrying the weight of someone who had borne command responsibility for decades. Colonel Henry Caldwell Reed said slowly, an officer from a top-secret special operations unit. A few young soldiers swallowed hard. Someone drew a quiet breath. The missions he carried out, Reed continued, were never entered into public records. No plaques were hung. No stories were told during parades. He paused for a brief moment, because if they had been exposed, those men would never have had a chance to come home. Reed glanced down at the memorial program in Caldwell's hands. The names he is reading, Reed said, belonged to those who were not as fortunate as he was. Fallen teammates. Men this nation still owes a debt to. No one spoke. Evan Cole stood rigid, sweat beading at his temples. Sir Cole stammered, I didn't know. You didn't need to know, Reed cut him off. You needed to learn. Reed turned and fixed his gaze on Cole. First Lieutenant Evan Cole, he said, you have publicly disrespected a superior commissioned officer, a man whom even several generals in this room stand to salute. Cole opened his mouth, then closed it again. Sir, you are relieved of duty effective immediately, Reed said firmly. You are removed from command. You will report to your immediate superior after this meal. The room held no murmurs, only the heavy silence of a lesson carved deep. Cole stood there, his face drained of color. Yes, sir, he said quietly, his voice breaking on the final word. Reed didn't look at him again. He turned back to Caldwell as if Cole no longer existed. Colonel Reed said we owe you an apology, not for failing to recognize you, but for allowing this to happen within our own base. Caldwell looked at Reed. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction either. Only a faint weariness, the kind carried by someone who had seen the same cycle repeat too many times. There's no need, Caldwell said. His voice was low and even, no louder than necessary. They're just children. The room shifted slightly at those words. They don't yet understand the cost of war, Caldwell continued, and no one has taught them. He swept his gaze across the young faces standing still. We were the same once, he said. We thought rank was everything. We thought speaking the loudest meant being strong. Caldwell lowered his eyes to the booklet in his hands. Then we learned, he said. Not from victory, but from those who never came back. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to turn away. Evan Cole stood there, fists clenched. "Sir." "Colonel," he said, his voice trembling. Caldwell shook his head slightly. "There's nothing more to say," he replied. "Remember this feeling, and hope you never have to learn it the way we did." Reed nodded slowly. That he said to the entire room is the lesson. Not a lesson about rank, not a lesson about power, but a lesson in humility before things one has never lived through. Caldwell closed the memorial program, unhurried, gentle, as if each page sealed was a quiet farewell. He paused for a brief moment, then lifted his head. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will read these names, whether anyone remembers them or not." Reed straightened. "We will remember," he said. The room remained standing, no longer tense. Only a quiet respect remained, spreading like a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. And when grace replaced retaliation, when the lesson had been delivered without further punishment, the story moved toward its final moment, where what endured was no longer power, but legacy. Henry Caldwell rose from the table without saying another word. He didn't look around, didn't seek anyone's eyes, and didn't wait for attention. His movements were slow yet decisive, as if everything that needed to be said had already been said. The chair slid back slightly, just enough for those nearby to realize that this moment was coming to a close. Caldwell walked on. No command rang out. No slogan was shouted. But after he had taken only a few steps, it happened. One person straightened, then another. Then the entire room, every soldier one by one, rose to attention voluntarily. No signals, no reminders. They stood because they understood, and because for the first time that afternoon, they knew exactly what they were standing before. The silence spread, not heavy, not tense. It was the silence of acknowledgement. The younger soldiers stood a little straighter. Hands released their food trays. Eyes held no curiosity now, no confusion, only a simple respect for a man who had lived long enough to need no further proof of who he was. Caldwell felt it even without turning back. He knew this feeling. Not the feeling of victory, but the feeling that comes when those who remain finally understand why others never returned. He slowed his pace by a fraction, not to prolong the moment, but because age had left its mark. Still, his stride remained steady, upright. Maria Lopez stood in the middle of the room, her eyes following that retreating figure. She didn't stand at attention in formal ceremony. She simply stood still, arms relaxed at her sides, as if standing before something greater than rank. As Caldwell neared the exit, Lopez spoke, her voice not loud but clear enough for those nearby to hear. That she said is a real soldier. No one argued. No one laughed. The words didn't need emphasis. They found their place in the room on their own, just as Caldwell had from the beginning, quiet yet impossible to overlook. Caldwell kept walking. He left the dining hall carrying the folded memorial program in his hand. The names inside that booklet needed no speech. Tomorrow he would stand before Stone and read each name again. He would read slowly, slowly enough to give each name a moment of existence, if only in the memory of those still alive. He knew not everyone would remember, but that didn't matter. His mission had never been recognition. His mission was to ensure those names never vanished completely, and he had carried out that mission for many years without witnesses. Inside the dining hall, soldiers began to sit back down, but the meal was no longer the same. No one spoke loudly. No one joked. Some stared down at their trays as if realizing there were things they had never paid a price to earn. Others looked toward the direction Caldwell had gone, trying to fix that upright silhouette in their minds, so that one day when they grew old, they would still remember what they once stood up for. Caldwell stepped outside without looking back. He carried no resentment, no sense of being honored. He carried only memory, as he always had memories that were heavy but necessary. Memories that taught him true courage does not need noise, and dignity never comes from silencing others. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please like, share this video, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories, so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,